The Studebaker Company began operations in 1852 as a wagon builder and ceased in 1968. It introduced its first vehicles really in the early 1900s and actually started out in 1902 with electric vehicles. But by the time the 1950s rolled around, Studebaker was well known as a manufacturer of automobiles. And today we're going to focus on, let's say, the most distinctive. I don't know that I'd call them beautiful, although I did have that in the title. 1950 to 1951 bullet nose Studebakers, because there's a lot of history associated with these. Now, the bullet nose Studebaker wasn't necessarily unique for the time. In fact, it wasn't even necessarily the first car to have that bullet nose and kind of airplane-like theme up front with the intake. You could trace that perhaps even to the 1949 and 1950 Ford, which had a similar theme, the so-called shoebox Fords. And while there wasn't really that bullet nose or that midsection on it, even the 1948 Tucker with the three headlamps up front kind of has a similar theme, I would say, up front as the bullet nose Studebakers. So there was some precedent in the market for, let's say, a vehicle that looked like this. Now, I have to say, take a look at the scale model that you see here that was produced in 1943 as a proposal for a post-war Studebaker. And I actually think this is a really handsome design. I love the headlamps that are behind, let's just call it plexiglass or maybe even glass in terms of the model. And you have a little bit of that bullet nose up front, but it's significantly more blunted, and you have this distinctive V-shape from above, something that you would not see in the final version of the Studebaker. Though overall, I think that this was an attractive proposal. I don't know how Studebaker was proposing to get air into the grill to cool the engine, though, because there's really no grill, so to speak of. Probably one of the first cars that was not an electric car that didn't have a grill would have been this particular proposal for a post-war Studebaker. In any case, let's talk a little bit about the design of the 50 and 51 Studebaker, because that's really why they are so famous or infamous. Now, these cars were styled by Raymond Loewy Associates, and by this point, Raymond Loewy was well known as a designer of automobiles, locomotives, cosmetics, a whole host of things. He really entered the design of cars with some of the contracts that his firm had with Hupmobile. And I would say perhaps most successfully, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, was the 1934 Hupmobile Aerodynamic, which clearly is a beautiful vehicle and one that perhaps was inspirational, but wasn't a commercial success, in part because Hupmobile itself just was pretty challenged at that point. In any case, Loewy signed his first contract with Studebaker in 1936, and the 1938 models were really the first ones that were credited to Raymond Loewy and Associates. Now, interestingly, a number of individuals would work for Raymond Loewy over the years, including Virgil Exner, who would later become head of Chrysler Styling before he would be fired in 1962. Gordon Burig was another who worked for Raymond Loewy, the famous designer of the cord, the coffin nose cord, 810 is an example. And in any case, Loewy was certainly well known as an individual who had great designs, but at the same time, he was also known for taking credit for other designers' work. And this was something that irked a number of the people that worked for him. He really was kind of a shameless self-promoter, and as I said, he took credit for things, and regardless of whether or not he himself was the one who inspired them, it might have just been his firm and somebody who works for his firm. But Loewy was famous for saying at one point in time that he takes credit for the successes because he also has to take credit for the failures. In any case, Loewy was well established with Studebaker, obviously, by the time the bullet nose came out. But interestingly, Exner would almost have an insubordinate moment with Loewy and Associates, and this occurred in the mid-1940s. More specifically, Exner was working with Studebaker Engineering Vice President Roy Cole on the all-new 1947 models, and Exner and Cole actually worked up their own proposals for the 1947 models in secret and kind of boxed Loewy out of the entire process. management actually ended up choosing this particular proposal for the 1947 Studebakers, as Studebaker was well ahead of the competition in releasing its post-war vehicles. It really introduced those in mid-1946, whereas others were waiting for a bit longer. Interestingly, of course, because of this insubordinate moment, Loewy fired Exner and replaced him with Bob Bork, who was at the time somebody who was working for Exner. Bork had significantly contributed to the 1947 design, but he would end up heading Raymond Loewy's South Bend studio all the way into 1955. And after 1955, Studebaker and Raymond Loewy would no longer work together. Those 1947 Studebakers and the little changed 1948s were well received by the public. But by the time 1950 rolled around, it was time to have something that was radical and new, and hence the so-called bullet nose. Now, the bullet nose had been something that was on the drawing board of various Studebaker designers, including Bob Bork, all the way back to the early 1940s. And as I mentioned, you could see in that early model a little bit of the bullet nose, but it certainly got more exaggerated with these large pontoon fenders and that spinner-type front end. And a number of the Studebaker managers were loath to accept a design proposal that was absolutely radical for the time period. But remember, Raymond Loewy was a real salesperson, and he said to these individuals that they need to aim at a feeling of the impression of an airplane, really, and a car that looked like it was light and fast, had a feeling of motion and speed. I don't know that the 1950 to 51 Studebakers achieved that, but like I said, Loewy himself was a salesman. And of course, what did Studebaker call this new look? It called it the, quote, next look. And that's even though the 1949 Ford, as I mentioned previously, already had this look. And in any case, I think Studebaker thought that this was going to be a trend-setting design. It certainly was not that. But the cars were released in August of 1949, about a month ahead of other 1950 models, and dealers originally were very excited by the public's acceptance of the design, reporting that they were seeing record crowds and high public acceptance. And I guess one could say that the 1950 and 1951 Studebakers were, decent sellers. The 1950 model year saw 343,000 sales of the Champion and the more upscale and longer wheelbase Commander lineup. In 1951, the sales plummeted to 268,000. So not horrible necessarily, but, I would say not great either. Now, what's amazing about this entire thing is that there wasn't really all that much new to the design of the 1950 Studebakers. They really had a lot that was in common with the 1947 to 1949 models, except, of course, the bullet nose, some trim, and then out back there were vertical tail lamps instead of previously horizontal tail lamps. But there was a bit more wheelbase to these. The Champions, the lower end, now had a wheelbase of 113 inches. The Commanders had 120 inches. And both lines had 2- and 4-door sedans, a convertible, and there was a 5-passenger Starlight coupe with this beautiful panoramic rear window that is the subject of the black car that we are discussing. That is a Starlight coupe, and it really is a panoramic window. That is, I think, quite cool. Now, both the Champion as well as the Commander had the Deluxe and Regal Deluxe trim. Ooh. And they used, interestingly, the same terminology for both the Champion Deluxe, the Champion Regal Deluxe. There was a Commander Deluxe, a Commander Regal Deluxe. The only thing I would say is that the lower-end Champion started out with a lowest-end custom model that the Commander did not have, and then the Commander had an upper-end Land Cruiser that had a 124-inch wheelbase that was a 4-door sedan. So there's a little bit of difference between the lineups. The custom started at $1,500 in base price, the custom Champion, I should say. And the, let's say, Land Cruiser Commander had a base price of $2,187. The most expensive in the lineup was the Regal Deluxe Commander Coupe, or convertible coupe, I should say. that had a base price of $2,300. So quite the lineup from Studebaker overall. The Champion Custom Sedan, as I mentioned, was really a low-end vehicle. It was introduced in March of 1950, and it didn't have a hood ornament, didn't even have a chromed headlamp and tail lamp surrounds. They were just painted, and only a small round trunk handle and light assembly. They just ended up looking super cheap, but heck, they were. At this point, Studebaker with that particular model was trying to target the low price three, the Chevy, Ford, and Plymouth buyers, and they advertised to the buying public, it's 4 to see instead of 3, meaning that you better go see your Studebaker dealer to make sure that you check out a vehicle from Studebaker and not just one from the low price 3. Now, Studebakers for 1950 also had an all-new suspension. They had a double A-arm front suspension up front, as well as new shocks and long travel coil springs. Out back, they still had the leaf rear springs that the previous ones had. Now, the other big news for 1950 was that Studebaker introduced an automatic transmission that was jointly developed with the Detroit Gear Division of Borg Warner, and it was introduced beginning on the Land Cruiser models in April of 1950 and then proliferated to the rest of the lineup. Now, this was actually a little bit different automatic transmission in a number of ways. It was air-cooled versus liquid-cooled, like most of the competition, and it allowed for push starts, which some of the other automatics did admittedly allow for. But it did have a hill holder, and if you put the transmission in reverse at a speed more than 10 miles per hour, it would not engage to help prevent damage. So Studebaker was the only independent, aside from Packard, to really develop its own automatic transmission, and it was pretty successful. Ford wanted to even buy the automatic drive for its 1951 line, but Studebaker said no. This particular transmission would continue through 1954, after which Studebaker would change to its Flight-O-Matic transmission. Now, as I mentioned, the sales figures, in particular for the 1950 model year of 343,000 cars, weren't necessarily huge compared to the low price 3. It was a good year, I should say, for Studebaker. And they ended up having to add a third shift at their South Bend factory, and they continued to hire employees and made quite a bit of money. In fact, one of the things that perhaps all this money that was coming in the door for Studebaker ended up funding was a new overhead valve V8. So remember, during this time, it would take until 1955, as an example, for Chevrolet to have their overhead valve V8. Of course, Oldsmobile and Cadillac had theirs in 1949. But Studebaker released an overhead valve V8 in 1951, beginning on the Land Cruiser and the Commander, and it was 233 cubic inches. So Studebaker came out with an overhead valve V8, I would say, significantly in advance of the low price 3, and, well, even more expensive marks. As an example, Pontiac didn't have an overhead valve V8 until the 1955 model year. And Buick would not release its overhead valve V8, the so-called nailhead, until the 1953 model year. So Studebaker was way ahead here, and I'll say it had a decent amount of horsepower from 233 cubic inches, 120 horsepower, which was quite good for the time. And the engine was even 54 pounds lighter than Cadillac's overhead valve V8. So overall, pretty good, I would say, engine that was introduced. And I think the engine also had great success in the mobile gas economy run back during the day. So Studebaker was doing pretty well for this particular period of time. Now, for 1951, there were admittedly some styling changes to the Studebakers, and now the 1951s had this smaller spinner up front and different texture, kind of an egg crate texture to the grille. And they had a painted ring around the bullet nose as opposed to a chrome trim ring. So I guess they were trying to make it look a little bit less obvious for whatever reason. And out back, more models got the single-piece rear window as opposed to the multi-piece rear window. The tail lamps got a little bit bigger. And functionally, all the Studebakers for 1951 now rode atop 115-inch wheelbase as opposed to the 113 for the Champions, 120 for the Commanders that was previously the case. I should actually caveat that. The Land Cruiser still did get 4 inches more wheelbase. It was 119 versus 115 for the Commanders, but the Champion and the Commander both had the same wheelbase. But to make up for that, you got the V8 in the Commander as standard, the 233 cubic inch V8. In the previous year, the Champion had, as an example, 170 cubic inch six-cylinder. The Commander had a 246 cubic inch inline six. The Champion engine from 1950 made 85 horsepower. The Commander engine made 102 horsepower. And so the Commander V8 for 1951 making 120 was a nice little step up. And there were some other positive changes for 1951. The suspension was now the so-called Miracle Ride, and the chassis had wider and stronger front control arms, had new shocks, and then the rear, in particular, leaf spring setup changed. It was previously a 5-leaf spring, now had a 4-leaf spring. Those springs were widened about 50% to help with the overall ride. If you ended up getting a Commander, you had the standard hill holder feature or the Land Cruiser. The Champion buyers had to pay $12.50 for the hill holder. And by the way, that was something that Studebaker had pioneered in 1936 and had introduced it back then. So, in any case, the 1950 and 1951 Studebakers, while the sales weren't necessarily great by Big Three standards, the cars really were very, very successful for the time and really helped Studebaker propel itself in the 1950s. And then, of course, in 1953, Studebaker would come out with the beautiful cars, the coupes, just fantastic-looking vehicles. But unfortunately, it wouldn't be all that long before Studebaker would have some significant challenges. And, well, it would, let's just say, start fading from history in the not-too-distant future. But for a brief period of time, the 1950 and 1951 Studebakers were just kind of great timepieces and great vehicles, well accepted by the public despite their kind of quirky styling, although the styling never really did take off beyond that 1949 Ford and this 1949 to 1950 Ford and 1950 to 51 Studebaker. I should point out that at least these vehicles did have some really nice interiors, especially on the upper end trims, and in particular, this one with the panoramic rear window. Take a look at the rear seat area. You really did have a panoramic view when you got the Starliner variant in the Studebaker lineup. So what do you think of these particular Studebakers? Quirky, beautiful, ugly? Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know. Thanks again for watching.